Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Coalition for Conservation webinar on regenerative agriculture. I'm Krista Lacco, the CEO of C4C. I'd like to start, as I always do, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm speaking from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and paying my respects to their elders, past and present. Australia is recognized as a global leader in innovation and regenerative agriculture. And tonight, we gather to explore how regenerative agriculture practices, born of Australian expertise, can be harnessed to address pressing global challenges from food security to climate change adaptation. This event is part of a much broader initiative led by C4C with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, aiming to foster collaboration between Australia and African nations in climate adaptation through agricultural practices and technology. We've already seen the fruits of our project, including engagement with African countries and legislators at COP28 last year in Dubai, and subsequent meetings that we've been hosting for knowledge exchange. So Australia's role in supporting regenerative agriculture in Africa spans various fronts, from knowledge sharing, which is what we're trying to do, and technology transfer, to capacity building, to investment, policy advocacy, and so on. So I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our African friends and the participants which are connecting tonight from the African continent, representing nations like Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa. Welcome to the Australia-Zambia Business Council, who are here as spectators, the State Department of Livestock in Nairobi, and many other organizations watching us tonight. In Australia, I'd like to especially welcome His Excellency Dr. Wilson Kogo. He's the ambassador of Kenya to Australia, who's watching us, and Ambassador Dr. Elias Munshia, the High Commissioner of Zambia to Australia and New Zealand, who's joining the panel soon. Also joining our panel, we have Senator Perrin Davey, the Shadow Minister for Water and Emergency Management, Dr. John White, he's the chairman of the Regenerative Australian Farmers, Caroline Hall, the CEO of the Mulloon Institute, Professor Robin Batterham, the chairman of the Net Zero Australia Steering Committee, and Dean Belfield, who's a farmer and also a director of the Regenerative Australian Farmers. So I was going to kick off by inviting Senator David to set this, the conversation and give us an overview on the Australian farming sector, but she hasn't joined us yet. She's probably still sitting at Parliament. So I will now just ask a few questions from Ambassador Munshia. I'm going to check whether he's connected. I'll just have to find him somewhere. Oh, there's Senator Perrin David just joined us just in time. Welcome, Perrin. We went through the introductions. We would like for you to kick off. Give us a little bit of a feel of what you know, and you know so much because of your portfolio and also being a regional and a farmer, a regional person and a farmer. So we'd like to welcome you and get you to speak to the participants on your experience and what Australia has done so well in regenerative agriculture and carbon soil. You just have to unmute yourself, Perrin. Sorry.
I do. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Christina, and thanks to the Coalition for Conservation. I am very excited about this topic. It is clearly not just about climate change. This topic is so important for the sustainability of our agriculture into the future. We know the old-fashioned, but at the time, best knowledge agricultural practices are not always fit for our new landscapes, such as Africa and Australia. Worked in England, was good for a time in our places, but we've learned so much over generations, and now bringing all that new knowledge together, but also understanding what is happening with our climate going forward and how we can improve. There's really exciting opportunities. Here in Australia, our farmers manage nearly 60% of the Australian landscape, and so they are so important into the stewardship of Australia. I recently went out to Western New South Wales. I visited a major farming operation out there, a cotton farming operation, so broadacre farming, and this family have turned their farm around from being large emitters, carbon emitters, terrible soil degradation, and they were losing productivity. And through implementing new practices, through taking a biodiverse view of their farming practices, incorporating biodiversity, measuring their soil carbon and their soil structure, and introducing new cropping rotations, they've gone from being carbon negative to actually being a carbon positive farm. And here in Australia, we've got a carbon farming initiative. These people could be trading their carbon units on the markets, but they have actually chosen not to. Rather, they're keeping their carbon credits on farm. So it's sort of like hedging their bets for the future. But what they can do, because they now measure their on-farm soil carbon, and it's all accounted for, it's accredited, they can market their cotton. It's carbon neutral cotton, and they are getting a market premium for that cotton. Here in Australia, we can measure our cotton from paddock to t-shirt, and they're getting a very good premium. That's just one example of the opportunities that are in place. But I also want to acknowledge some of the work that successive governments have done in Australia, not just on soil carbon and on-farm carbon sequestration. And it's really important to recognise that on-farm carbon sequestration is not limited to trees and revegetation, but it is also about measuring your soil baselines and then changing your practices to improve the soil carbon capture, which is what the farm that I visited had done. And they've done so through a 6-year crop rotation process, and reintroducing, so keeping the organic matter in the soils and zero till, a lot of farm practices that have been worked up over the years, but also recognising that our farmers should be rewarded for stewardship. The former coalition government developed the Agricultural Biodiversity Stewardship Package, which included an accreditation scheme and the potential for a biodiversity stewardship market. First of its kind internationally, the government worked with the Australian National University to actually develop a scientific, robust way to measure biodiversity on farm. There were 12 trial sites identified and developed, and there was work being undertaken to develop a trading platform and a mechanism so farmers could actually reap the benefit of what they do on farm. Pleasingly, the current Labor government has continued the trial sites and the work into that stewardship bill. They've also expanded it, so it's not just limited to farms, it's also open to all land and sea tenures, including national parks, including Indigenous owned land, which is really important. And so the work that our Indigenous land and river managers do can be incorporated into that. They're working on establishing a committee which will advise the minister on the next step. So we're really watching closely as to how that plays out. But in the meantime, I need to acknowledge our farmers here in Australia and the work they're doing. They're getting on with the job. They're not waiting for government to show them what they must do. It's actually farmers who are developing the practices to make sure that they are doing the right thing by our environment. And through that, making much more resilient farms. There's better soil moisture retention, better soil carbon. They're getting better profits out of it. That's it in a nutshell. But I know that there'll be questions later on. But I don't want to hog the floor because I really want to hear from my other presenters as well.
Thank you, Perrin, very much. And I forgot to mention that you did attend COP28 with us, and you actually moderated a panel between Africa and Australia on sustainability and agriculture. But I will now introduce the ambassador, Ambassador Dr. Elias Munshia. Very welcome to our session here, Elias. The prolonged dry spell has had immense destructive consequences across critical sectors of agriculture in your country. Back in Zambia, it's been declared national disaster, all the droughts that you're having. So all of these threats that are posed by climate change at the moment, and how could you describe that situation to us? And how do you see Australia being able to assist in this exchange of innovation and practices, helping farmers build resilience and adaptation? You're still muted, yes.
Thank you very much for having me today. I thank you, the Coalition for Conservation. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. And since we are talking about agriculture, it becomes important for us to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we farm and grow our food. And we pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for having me and for having opened the discussion to my country, to Zambia, to give its views about this very important subject of regenerative agriculture and sustainable farming. I also acknowledge that your organization is quite at the forefront of confronting the issues that we face right now in our world, that is climate change, but not only that, but transforming lives through sustainable agricultural practices. Zambia is a relatively big country. It covers about 752,000 square kilometers. Our terrain is mostly plateau savanna, and the climate is dry and a little bit temperate. Of all the area of arable land in Zambia, about 15% has been utilized for agriculture production, and our population is about 19 million people. You may note that Zambia is surrounded by 8 neighbors, so we are land-linked to about 8 neighbors. We are 19 million, but once we add our neighbors together, we are over 100 million people. Climate change has had an impact on our country, just like it has been noted earlier by Chris. You will see that we are experiencing a dry spell right now. As a matter of fact, what we are experiencing now has been declared as a national disaster and a national emergency by our President Hakainde Hichilema. What this means is that there is a challenge to food security in our country. We are facing right now that we are estimating that 1 million households are likely to be affected by this drought. And so our country is appealing for at least $1 billion, close to $1 billion in order to help meet the immediate needs for food security. Nevertheless, Zambia stands very open to grow its agriculture, but the growth of the agriculture is not necessarily to have more land to produce, but rather to raise our yields per hectareage. Raising our yields will mean then that we have to look at drought adaptable technologies that may be used in order for us to use the water that is available to us, and also to make sure that we do so in a very, very sustainable fashion. Just today, Africans are meeting in Nairobi, and our president, as well as several other heads of state in Southern Africa, they are meeting in Nairobi, in Kenya, at the invitation of President William Ruto, and they are discussing issues to do with soil, with fertilizers, and with productivity in agriculture. We are very ready as Zambia and several African nations to grow our production. and to do so in a very sustainable way. Australia has been at the forefront of this sustainable and regenerative agriculture. We want to network with like-minded organizations here in Australia. We've already been making appeals and we've already been making linkages with organizations such as ASIA, the Australian Council for Agricultural International Research, as well as several faculties of agriculture around Australian universities, so that we could share these technologies and grow our agriculture in Zambia. Zambia's agriculture contributes only 3% to its GDP. With a nation that is threatened by food security, we see that there is an opportunity here for agriculture to play a wider role in the wealth of our country and in addressing some of the economic challenges we face. Therefore, some of the strategies and ideas that are going to be shared today are going to not only be conversation starters, but they are going to perhaps start a passion among most of our Zambian listeners here, so that they can look at how they can use sustainable methods in their agriculture. Zambia produces maize, millet, sorghum, and barley. And we know that we can do so, feed our population, feed our neighbors, and do so in a sustainable fashion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your explanation on what's happening in Zambia at the moment and the potential of growing the agricultural sector, Dr. Elias. I would like to perhaps bring into the conversation Dr. John White, who has enormous experience and knowledge on regenerative agriculture now, and he can tell us a little bit about how these practices can reduce emissions, but also improve yield and help with mitigation. Dr. White, you know a lot about the Carbon Farming Initiative and Emissions Reduction Fund. Perhaps you can tell the audience and share some light.
Thank you, Chris. And I echo the previous acknowledgements of the First Nations people in this country on whose land we reside and work. It's worth noting that our Indigenous peoples in Australia really looked after the land for tens of thousands of years in a fashion which we really do need to set out to learn from. It's a pretty well-known fact and verified by our national science body, CSIRO, that since European settlement in Australia, our farming techniques, the way in which we've cleared the land and fairly harshly treated it with ploughing and burning and overgrazing, has pretty much across the agricultural landscape of Australia, which consists of many hundreds of millions of hectares of land, we've decreased the soil carbon content by between 2/3 and 3/4 of what that soil carbon content was under thousands of years of Indigenous stewardship. That amounts to a vast amount of CO2 equivalent that has been erased from our soils, not to mention the carbon that existed in the above ground vegetation. In fact, there are estimates that say we've oxidized, we've eroded, we've allowed to dissipate some 150 billion to 200 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent from our agricultural soils and landscape. Now that's around about 300 years of our current CO2 emissions per annum. So really just what I want to say, to be brief, is that if we just work out how to change our agricultural practices to take advantage of nature's own solution to drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by photosynthesis and by the action of microbiology and other biology, micro animals, then we can sequester that atmospheric CO2 productively back into the soils. And I would say for a century or more, we can be rebuilding the quality, the productivity, the biological life, the resilience, the water holding capacity, and most importantly, the food production capacity of hundreds of millions of hectares of Australian soils. And we can be producing probably many times the amount of food and healthier food than we are today. The secret is how to educate farmers, how to help farmers, how to facilitate farmers, possibly through carbon credits markets, how to financially incentivate farmers to learn the new, well, they're not new, they're actually very old, but to relearn the regenerative agricultural practices that rebuild the carbon content and the quality of our soils. And if that learning takes place in Australia and can be shared with other continents, with other countries, all the much better. But interaction is vital between countries and communities around the world. So this is a forum which is really important so that we can really kick off at a greater pace those regenerative farming practices in a way that farmers produce more, make more profit, and become more sustainable. Others on this panel, such as Dean and Carolyn, will be able to talk about the actual regenerative farming practices, probably in much more expert fashion than I. So if I could leave it at that, please, Chris.
Thank you so much, John. And it's really important point you made on how can we build partnerships with Indigenous communities who have so much knowledge in how to maintain the land. We can talk about that a bit later on, because I would love to bring Carolyn Hall into the conversation, because she's the CEO of the Mulloon Institute, and I'm aware that they do a lot of work in regenerative agriculture. So, building resilient landscapes, which is the base for everything, so that we can withstand the extreme climate change that's happening. Carolyn, welcome, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thanks to the Coalition for Conservation. I'm coming to you this evening from the lands of the Biripi people on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that the Mulloon Institute does. We're a not-for-profit, and as John mentioned, we work directly with Australian farmers and First Nations communities to repair and restore agricultural landscapes. Our work's been recognised by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and it will actually be presented as part of a global drought resilience report at COP16 of the Convention to Combat Desertification in Riyadh in December this year. So we're very excited and enthusiastic to share the work that we do across lots of networks. John has really pointed out how 200 years of changed land use in Australia has really altered our landscapes, and our particular focus is on water and how the way water moves through the landscape has changed. It's concentrated, and that's caused erosion. It moves much faster, and that makes our landscapes vulnerable to drought, to bushfire, and to flood. We use research. We have 18 years of research coming out of our Mulloon Rehydration Initiative on the southern tablelands of New South Wales. We use an education and capacity building program, and we use demonstration sites to show how we use natural infrastructure, so how we actually intervene in the landscape, and we use rocks and logs and earthen banks. We actually do work in the landscape to repair our streams and rivers and to slow that water down, to bank it in the landscape and rebuild our spongy wet floodplains that are more productive. They grow more of anything. They're more resilient to climate shocks. They support biodiversity and they sequester carbon. And we have a very technically rigorous approach to this, the design and the delivery of this natural infrastructure. And we're doing this work across Australia. So on the southern tablelands, in the reef catchments, in southwest WA, in central Australia with a variety of First Nations groups and ranger groups, and also in Victoria and very soon South Australia and Tasmania. We really think that we bring agriculture, the environment and traditional knowledge together to heal our landscapes and our communities. I'll leave it there because I've got so much more to tell, but
thank you, Karen. And it's wonderful to hear about the work that the Institute does, and even for Ambassador Munshia to get to know more about it, because the next step is obviously to connect farmers and other institutes from African countries like Zambia with you, so that there's more exchange of knowledge, exchange of practices. But thank you for this. And I'll invite now Professor Robin Betteram, who has quite a bit of knowledge as well in reducing emissions reductions in general, but in this case today talking about emissions reductions through soil sequestration. Professor, welcome. You participated in other events with us before, so it's lovely to see you again.
Chris, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this event. And like the others, I acknowledge the lands that I'm on and the elders, past, present and future, in particular of the Wurundjeri people. I'm in a building, and if you're in Melbourne, come and visit the building and come and visit me by all means. Melbourne Connect, it's called. And it was designed in close consultation with the Wurundjeri elders. It is not like a building that you've seen before. It is a meeting place and a place of reconciliation, I might add. So much for the advertisement for the building that I'm in, and it's a joy to work in. Let's just start with a few quick comments on carbon budget. We're all captured by the 0 by 2050 or earlier if we can. Keeping warming to 1.5 or whatever. And it's very easy to make promises. It's much harder, as we all know, in real life, in anything, to deliver. And the carbon budget is, and I'm calling it a carbon budget, is a bit problematic. We can see how we can reduce emissions by not having such large cars, by electrification of anything and everything that we can. And so it goes on. But by the use of biofuels and so forth, but without entering debates about electricity generation and whether nuclear is a good, bad or indifferent, or the limits to afforestation and when sustainability limits kick in, without entering that debate, let me simply say that from the work that we've done in the Net Zero Australia project and similar work in the Net Zero America project, you cannot get to zero without a big effort. Now that sounds very obvious. Yes, we all agree with that. But when you look at the numbers and the costs and what has to change, it is a very big effort. You need every which way. Do not waste your time having debates about whether you should try this way or that way to get to net zero. It is such a big task, you need every which way. Now that brings me to the agricultural side and the soil carbon. And we have so many experts with us, both online and of course, sitting here in the panel. And thanks for pulling this lot together. I'm delighted that already we've had the Senator and we've had John and Carolyn rehearsing the benefits of getting your soil carbon up, the water retention, the resilience, the biodiversity, the productivity. But this is one of those things that you could make a promise to say, we're going to get soil carbon up. But the realities are Firstly, you've got to do it. And to do it, you've got to be able to measure it. And measurement at the moment is a bit of a challenge. It is to get reliable measurements, it is expensive, and you don't get them in real time. So how are we going to move forward with putting a lot more carbon in the soil, which is quite clearly good for the global carbon budget, but it's equally good for agricultural productivity and sustainability? And my part of this is to say we must make a lot more use of satellites, artificial intelligence, and sparse manual sampling, not just in the top layers of the soil, but down deep in the soil, because it's deep in the soil, particularly in drier climates and where we have more problems with droughts and temperature stress. It's deep in the soil that the carbon has the greater longevity. So let me summarize by saying measurement is a key here. And the more we can collaborate to make this happen, and the sooner we can make it happen, the better. We will all benefit. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much, Robin. And when you talk about measurement, we'll bring Dean in because he's a farmer, and it would be nice to hear from him whether, what's his perspective as a farmer and what results he might have seen with regenerative agriculture practices in his own business.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the invitation to speak. And it's a pleasure to be here in the company of such eminent people from across the world. The opportunity and challenge that we face now is extremely exciting, and it's unprecedented in almost every way. And we found that we can't solve, as Einstein, I think, was reputed to have said, we can't solve today's problems with the thinking that created them in the first instance. But what we can do is we can dig deep into our knowledge base and be bold enough to depart from what the conventional wisdom and in some respects science, but it's a different sort of science, which is driven by, in many respects, corporate self-interest, and there's nothing new about that. What we do back on the farm, and I should caveat my comments by saying that I grew up on a farm, and I witnessed a number of droughts into very tough times where farmers were shooting all their sheep in the middle of droughts, and then they turn the gun on themselves. It's quite horrific. So if we look at the context of farming and a discussion now in the sense of built capital, which is what humans actually do with money, we build things, we make things, and then we look at it in the context also of natural capital, which is what nature provides for us, and also we look at it in the context, so imagine a triangle or a tripod. The third being social capital, which is all about people and community, and they're all interrelated. And if you pull on one string, you pull on the others. And it's a very sobering way of assessing it, because we have the opportunity here, which is quite unique. Instead of eroding from one of the capital stocks to the benefit of the other, we can actually lift all three at the same time, which is really quite remarkable. And so from my own background, growing up on a farm, realizing that you can't make a lot of money on farming and it's a tough gig, I went and became an engineer, just like some others on the call here. And then I also pursued a postgrad in environmental science. So in a way, my own triangle to get a perspective with the technology, with the natural side of things, nature and the environment, and tried to weave all those together and providing a holistic solution in terms of how we approach agriculture and essentially what nature gives us, rather than the reductionist thinking or siloed thinking, which is what we see evident across the world today. So if we come back to the farm and if we link it to, let's say, to provide a context to this discussion, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of which I think there are 17 now, about 11 of those have a direct relationship to what we might call regenerative agriculture. And those who are familiar with those will actually quickly identify that there are probably at least 11, maybe more out of the 17 that agriculture and the work that we do can directly benefit. Regardless, in the world, where in the world this takes place. You know, soil is soil, plants are plants, humans are humans, and we have this level of codependence which is very strong and very close. So, and our farm is essentially we see it as a bit of a laboratory. We were the first, so we actually certified biodynamic beef, so biodynamic and organic, so there's no chemicals used at all. We would be decertified if we did. When I say chemicals, as in synthetic chemicals and fertilizers and herbicides and fungicides and all the sides. So, and we were there, when we started down this track, we thought, well, it just happened to coincide with the carbon farming initiative and the opportunity to register a soil carbon project. And so we registered the first soil carbon project in Victoria and one of the first in Australia. And then we've been working with groups of farmers similarly on their own farms around soil carbon projects. And what I should say is really, and we're now in a position to say this, and perhaps just over 12 months ago, I may not have been able to do that, and that is the farms we've been working with, including our own, have undertaken regenerative agricultural practices. So what is it that farmers are doing? What is it they're not doing? How's their thinking shifted? Are they operating from the same paradigm as they used to? I mean, really exciting questions. And what have they found that's worked? What have they found that hasn't worked? And the learning is enormous. But the upshot is that the results have been, in many respects, quite remarkable. And not just in terms of the soil carbon that's been built, but all the other co-benefits that go along with that. And some of them have been mentioned already, but things such as being able to provide a level of mitigation at the local level, when of course, if you join all the dots, local becomes region, region becomes national, and then it becomes global. So you start at the local level and on farm, both mitigation and adaptation, the climate constraints, which includes drought and water availability, a level of resilience, which we desperately need. And that flows through to our hip pocket, it flows through our mental well-being, community well-being, and so on. And all these are tied together in terms of, let's see how we can use the tools and techniques and understandings that we have to reduce risk right across the board. I've just, for the benefit of this brief conversation, I've drawn a little diagram. So if you can imagine in your mind, if you like, a box with a number of little rectangles in the box, or the layer at the bottom, and then the next one, the next one, the next one. And the bottom one is called soil, and the one above that plants, and the one above that animals, and the one above that humans. And instead of looking from the top downwards as humans down towards the animals, and they eat grass and pastures, and those pastures come from the soil, and the microbes in the soil. And often we don't even think, once we get to the soil, it's out of sight because it's below ground, and we somehow lose the ability to relate to it. What I like to do is actually flip the whole thing upside down and pretend that if we were in the soil, what we need to do and how we need to work and love and treat that soil so that it's supremely healthy, so that the plants and the animals and the humans all benefit in ways that we can't imagine. And that's what the farmers that we are working with are now doing. They're making more money than they ever did. The productivity is greater than it was, and they're building soil carbon and soil health, coming back to soil health, down to those deeper layers that Robin was referring to, and they're doing it well, and they're seeing the benefit, and in ways that I think they are challenging the science, because there's a lot of science out there and differing views, and not necessarily a coalescence of the sciences. They are doing things which the challenge is there for the scientists to explain how this works. And a great initiative or opportunity through the work that Melbourne University has been doing and so on, and the projects that we've been working on or looking to bring together, is intended to do exactly that. So yes, it doesn't, the potential and opportunity is not limited at the local level or on-farm level. It's seriously international, because the bugs don't care, they just do the job, and if they're happy and they're healthy, then we're all benefiting and lives can only be better. So perhaps I'll just leave it at that point, and if there's specific questions, lovely, very happy to take them, but I'll leave it to you, Chris, to
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. What we'll do now, we have about 18 minutes, and I would like to hear from the audience as well. I'll ask the audience to type questions on our Q&A box. There's a few here, but before I go to those questions in the audience, I would like to ask Elias if he wants to ask any questions to any of the panelists at the moment, or have an interaction with Senator Perrin Davey, because part of the puzzle too is how policies and regulations can actually, or the regulatory reforms can benefit or support to scale up regenerative agriculture, better practices, restoration, and so on. So I'll leave it to the panelists to have their interaction now. Regulatory side, maybe Carolyn can also come up with some suggestions of what you see that where are the gaps in terms of policies, and what has worked and hasn't worked, Carolyn, that could work perhaps in Africa. And I'm not sure, Ambassador, if you ask any questions, given, representing the government.
Thank you very much. So the picture with what is happening in Africa is that contrary to some of the assumptions about Africa, in actual fact, for example, in Zambia, only about 15% of our land is actually, of our arable land is actually being used for agricultural purposes. And so what we are looking at is increasing the yield of that 15% and not necessarily clearing more 15%. And so there is an opportunity here for countries such as Australia to partner with countries such as ours and send that message, and partner in the sense that how are we going to make agriculture much more sustainable? What investments are we going to make in drought-related, the drought-resistant seed, and the entire picture of climate adaptation. And so my question and my interaction with the government of Australia is, let us go there and create these partnerships and expand these partnerships. And this is an invitation to all of you. As you are working on all these efforts here in Australia, please know that there is a friend, there is a partner out there in Africa that is willing to work with you, to work to partner with some of the methods that you've already researched on and used, in order for us to make this one world a better world. Because we are in this together. If there are any lessons that we've learned out of the COVID crisis, is the fact that we are in fact so much more related and interrelated. And so it is an invitation to agricultural institutions here in Australia, agricultural organizations here in Australia, restorative agriculture, and all these practices that they are partners in Africa that are willing to work with you.
Thank you, Elias. And as you're aware, conversely, our organization is inviting the agricultural minister of Zambia and others from the Committee of Agriculture to come and visit and do tours and be part, and even meet the Maluna Institute and other experts here. So I believe that face-to-face interaction will start happening. We are working towards, but I would like for others to comment on what the ambassador has just posed. And then there are two questions for you on the Q&A box, Ambassador, that I'll read out in a minute. Perrin, would you like to comment?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. And Ambassador, I have had the pleasure of visiting Zambia, and it's an absolutely beautiful country. And in Botswana as well, I used to visit some of the agricultural production and seeing sorghum grow and millet and the crop types you have, and understanding that there are a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences in our farming techniques. We have a lot more large, expensive machinery. You've got a lot of labor, but the challenges of soil structure are very real for both of our nations, and working out ways that we can address and improve the soil structure to improve its productivity, and also reverse some of the former bad practices that both our nations inherited from our colonial forebears. One of the key issues that I keep hearing in Australia is very much the cost of measurement, and I think that was mentioned earlier, to get it right, because it's very easy. A lot of changing practice, you can see improvements in soil structure. But if we actually want to be able to account for it and associate it with emissions reduction, we do need to be able to measure it. I know in Australia we have undertaken several soil carbon measuring initiatives to try and encourage landowners to undertake measuring. But at the moment, it's quite expensive. I do believe it will be a matter of combination of factors, improving our measurement techniques, but also economies of scale. Once we make it standard practice and more people are doing it, the cost of the tests will reduce. But in the meantime, it's also providing the advice to landowners and to farmers of the benefits of rotational cropping, of rotational grazing, to allow the land and the soil to have a spell, and putting the organic matter back into the soils is very, very helpful. And I think it's getting that agronomic advice to the farmers on the ground, but it's also very important to allow the farmers to feel they have ownership and they're not being told from the top down, you must do, but educating them of, if you do, you might see this benefit, but allowing them to still make the decisions. Because certainly from my perspective as a senator and, living on a farm as I do and working with farmers, it is not up to government to tell farmers what they can and can't plant on their farm, but it is about encouraging them to make good choices to increase the sustainability of our lands.
So, Chris, I wonder if I could dive in and just add a little bit, only a little bit, to Senator Davies' comments. Perrin, thank you very much for that, for emphasising a few key points there. And if I just pick up on the one about the measurement and the measurement cost, what gets measured gets done is sort of an old adage that we all appreciate, and it just is too costly at the moment, measuring carbon. If we can crack the code on a cheaper, certifiable method down to depth, that's a game changer, and not just for Australia. And we should be trying this, of course, across a range of landscapes, the more the better, because essentially it comes down to marrying physics and agronomy and an awful lot of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of number crunching here that we have to do to come up with this cheap method. But when we do, and I'm fairly convinced we can, there's the possibility, and Dean Belfield has pointed this out on a few occasions, that you could get soil carbon in real time. I don't mean minute by minute, that's nonsense, but certainly on a week by week basis without sampling it. You'd be getting it from the satellite measurements and the modelling that sits on top of those measurements, and of course the occasional ground proofing. The same AI is capable in Australia of forward predicting monthly rainfall and intensity up to 12 months in advance. And you can build that into the picture as well. So real-time measurements that tells you how you're changing is around the corner. That corner, by the way, might be a few years off and quite some tens of millions by the time it's delivered, but there you go.
Thanks, Professor.
Thanks.
John or Carolyn, would you like to intervene? Carolyn?
I would. Yeah, I guess I'd just like to add to that, because it seems a little bit remote, all that technology around measurement when you're on the farm. A number of farmers, the majority of farmers that we work with, the focus is not around carbon. The focus is around working with nature and building their soil health. And carbon is actually a co-benefit of managing well and managing in partnership with nature. So there is quite a carbon tunnel vision across the world, which of course is really important if we're to reach the goal of net zero by 2030. But the flip side of, I guess, of emissions reduction is that we live within the limits of natural systems. And so we really need to have an equal and enthusiastic focus on the function of our landscape. So looking at our soil health, looking at how water moves through and how water is stored in the landscape, looking at the health of our biodiversity alongside our farmland, because we know all the data points to, healthy biodiversity is adjacent to a healthy and productive farm. So I guess I just want to balance that enthusiasm around a focus on measuring carbon and everything being carbon focused to this, the reality when you're working with farmers on the ground, it's about managing well, and carbon is a co-benefit.
Yeah.
And Chris, thank you, Caroline. And I think that's exactly the situation with most of what we are seeing in Africa, because sometimes there is this, movement towards let's push towards more carbon measuring, or the effectiveness of carbon measuring, and yet our farmers, their major concern at the moment, and government's major concern, is the fact that we produce enough food to feed our population. And if we are able to collapse all these concerns into how we do it in a sustainable way, I think that would be something that would work very much for our farmers and our countries. Instead of sometimes the commitment towards, I know these are quite practical concepts, but they might feel like they're much more abstract when you are explaining to an important stakeholder, an African farmer in this case. But once we use the strategies like Caroline has explained here, of making it very clear to our farmers, to our governments, to our people, that our focus is on maximizing the production of our food in a way that is sustainable for our farmers and our people, that will be far much easier.
To that point, Ambassador, Amir is asking a question. How are young people in Zambia adjusting to sustainable farming practices? And how can young Australians partner with young Zambians? He's also asking, what are your thoughts on climate change affecting food competition in your region?
Yes, indeed. The fact that Zambia and much of Southern Africa, the staple food, let me just get there, is maize. And so maize is grown in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and several other Southern African countries. And what we are seeing is that as a result of climate change and unpredictable rainfall and things like that, it is having an impact on our ability to grow maize that our people depend upon. But attached to that is the fact that in order for us to make maize, to grow maize that feeds our people, we must also be very clear to our people that maize production must be a business on the other hand, so that we are not just investing into growing maize for the sake of feeding our people, but also the farmer becomes the businessman or becomes the businesswoman, linking production of maize to raising the livelihoods of our people. Maize in Zambia, we've been dependent on maize for many years, and yet the farmer of the maize has become poorer when we compare with other demographics. My government seeks to change that. We want to see that as the nation depends on the maize, the one who is growing the maize actually takes it as a business and is able to earn a living out of that. And that is the biggest challenge that we have. Regarding young farmers in Zambia, government is taking several leads at the moment. First of all, it is to make farming appealing not only to older people, but to younger people as well. And we have seen several young people engaging in agriculture, growing maize to feed our people, growing rice, growing tomatoes, growing some of the cash crops that are ready for export to European markets, and we hope one day to the Australian markets. And for a young Zambian to be interested in agriculture, they must see that they will be able to live once they grow. There is a livelihood. There are economic benefits to themselves and to the country. And that is the message we are trying to put across to our people, and that is the message we are trying to send to our people. Again, it's not in clearing more land, but rather it's in making the 15% land that we have to raise our yields. And for Australian farmers, if you are looking for alternative places to partner and grow food and be in business, Zambia is very attractive, and Zambia is ready to partner with you.
Thank you. There's no doubt that Australia and Zambia are very large the food baskets for the world. And Elias, we should really partner in an exchange of technology like we're trying to program. So it's very exciting that you joined us today. I just wanted to ask any of the other speakers if they have any other comments on this. Otherwise, I'll ask the next questions from the panelists, from the participants. Yes, Dean. We can't hear you. I think you're still muted.
So my apologies for that.
No worries.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a quick qualification around the carbon. And we can get fixated on carbon per se. However, what we should remember is why is carbon so significant? And that is because it's the basis for the organic component of the soil. And the organic component of the soil is the basis for life. And the UN itself said that we have 60 seasons of topsoil left on the planet at the current rate of degradation of topsoil. And of course, where does our food come from? That top 6 inches of the soil. So carbon, it's not so much carbon the molecule or a version of carbon, whatever you like it to be. It's actually the fact that carbon is energy, and it is the apex indicator of soil health. Just like in the human condition, we go and get a blood test and so on, and we have indicators of what is good health. So if we see it not so much as carbon and a number that is measured, and of course measurement is critical, because without that we have no indication or understanding of where we're at, it is a very important indicator and seen more broadly in that context. So it's the basis of a healthy living soil, and if we're to address the impoverished soils or improve the current soils to grow not only maize but a whole range of biodiverse species, which then flows through to improving the soil health further and aiding, assisting drought resilience, rainfall retention, and so on, and all those other co-benefits that we're well aware of, then we do need to do whatever we can to build it, not obsessively, to build it in the context that builds landscape function. And the rest will flow from there in a remarkable way, I believe, and we're seeing that already. So that's all I wanted to say, just to add that qualification in there around carbon.
Yeah, and on that point, how do we educate, or what's the capacity building programs that you've seen work in terms of empowering farmers to adopt these agricultural practices? Because it involves some change in the way they do things, and that involves sometimes at high cost. What we're trying to do is exchange technologies and practices with sub-Saharan African nations that are not expensive for them, because we know it has to be affordable for small farmers.
Yes, absolutely right. And for example, one of the things that we're doing in our region here in Central Victoria, North Central Victoria, is we developed a curriculum, a learning curriculum around regenerative agriculture for the local farmers. And we have up to 70 farmers that are members of that program. And what that has done, it's touched different people in different ways, but essentially it's a combination. And I think this is very much the case, I'm sure, for African farmers and the communities that they support. And that's very much not just head and what we can intellectually work through and then do with our hands. It's actually a head, heart, and hands. Because when we bring the heart into it, we bring the community into it, and we bring life into it. And that's when we shift the paradigm. And so the educational syllabus that or the curriculum that we developed, it basically lays a foundation of all the core components that regenerative agriculture and farmers will need to have some understanding of, on which you can build that foundation and basis for then learning and developing the appropriate skills that are relevant in Zambia and different parts of Africa, for example. So yes, the behavioural, the cultural aspects are significant. The relationships that farmers have in terms of being able to learn from other farmers is enormous. And you know, it's really at that level, the grassroots level, that the change can occur, and everybody else in that whole sort of ecosystem, through to the politicians and so on, can all have a vital role to play, in my view. And that is really to facilitate what happens on the ground, not to make money out of it on the way through at the expense of the farmers, because that's what happens to farmers right across the world. And generally they're impoverished as a result of it, and therefore the community is, but actually work with farmers as part of a team. And then it gets really exciting, you know, and then you see the results. I can talk about this for hours, as you can see. I'm quite passionate about it, but really it's an opportunity that we've never seen on the planet before. It's quite extraordinary right now.
Yeah.
And Chris, we look forward to having those connections established with Zambian farmers as well, and that curriculum, Dean.
It'd be my pleasure.
That's very
important. And
in an exchange. Carolyn, yes.
Similarly, I would absolutely concur with Dean, and we too have been busy preparing a curriculum for landscape rehydration, so that underpinning, focusing on bringing groups of farmers together and learning about the function of their landscapes and what they can do, and that recognising that what we're driving here is really social change, and that is repairing and restoring landscapes. And regenerative farming, these are social processes. So what we've found through the delivery of our curriculum is bringing groups of farmers together and creating small communities of practice where they can share their stories, and their direct experiences has real power to support change. And that's a model that we're replicating across Australia, and it would be wonderful to see that trialled in Zambia as well.
If you're happy to stay on the line for a few more minutes, there's quite a few interesting questions popping up. This might be for you, Perrin, I would think, but how can new land stewardship funding models be designed to incentivize and support farmers in implementing sustainable practices?
Yeah, thanks very much. And this is the purpose of the biodiversity stewardship program. That's one area, which is to encourage and incentivize, but not dictate, which is really important, because you know, different farming practices have different techniques. Again, it comes back to being able to measure, to make sure that we are seeing improvements across the board in biodiversity. So not just in soil carbon, but also soil structure, biodiversity of flora and fauna on the farm. So farmers need to measure the baseline, and that's why when we were in government, we worked with the Australian National University to develop, and there are two measurement platforms that they helped us develop. One was for carbon plus biodiversity looking at new plantings of native vegetation and measuring biodiversity outcomes. And then there was also enhancing remnant vegetation, because we know that there's a lot of biodiversity gains to be made by just changing the way we manage existing remnant vegetation. There are further opportunities to be undertaken, but again, I mean, my very strong principle is it's about working with farmers. It's not about dictating to farmers.
Thank you, Perrin. And John, you mentioned, I'll ask this to you because you mentioned Indigenous practices and our, First Nations. So the question is, how can partnerships with rural and Indigenous communities enhance the effectiveness and sustainability of landscape restoration efforts? And are there any practical examples of that already happening? You just have to unmute yourself.
Right. There have been various programs for savanna burning, cool burning, which really gets back to very traditional management of the landscape that probably all of our First Nations peoples practiced for tens of thousands of years very, very effectively. They're well known, I think, with the public and doing some good work. But I think there needs to be a lot more focus on introducing actual regenerative agriculture, which is producing real crops and products and generating farming revenue for Indigenous communities. One program that I'm very aware of, and I want to refrain from doing a marketing campaign on it, but we've worked out that deep-rooted, perennial, often Indigenous plants, such as the humble old man saltbush, which has been, terribly overgrazed and eradicated and destroyed in many, many areas of rangelands Australia, could be reintroduced with Indigenous landowners and could be planted out quite intensely. These are plants that live for 60 to 100 years. They put roots down many, many meters, down to 6 and 8 meters, and they produce a lot of biomass in very, very harsh, often drought-stricken conditions, and they can survive with salty water. In fact, they can be irrigated with seawater. So there are tremendous opportunities for replanting these species together with other compatible deep-rooted perennial grasses. And the Aboriginal communities could be rotationally grazing these plantations. They could be harvesting these plants to produce animal feed for sale on the market. We're doing a study now as to the above ground biomass that could be created to then process it into sustainable aviation fuel, which there is a great need for because the aviation industry does need to find a way of becoming zero carbon emitters, and I doubt that hydrogen is going to be the answer. So look, Australia with hundreds of millions of degraded hectares of rangelands has enormous productive opportunities through these sorts of programs, and probably hundreds of millions of hectares of this land that is suitable for this is controlled by Indigenous First Nation people. It just happens, and Robin mentioned it earlier, that these plants are really prolific at putting down deep roots and sequestering in a very stable fashion for thousands of years CO2 via photosynthesis as root matter. So we could be creating, if we could measure it with Robin's satellite-based AI systems, hundreds of millions of tons of soil organic matter locked away for thousands of years. And Australia could therefore foreseeably become a much more easily a net zero economy with the tremendous cooperation of our Indigenous people.
Thank you very much, John. I think we have only time for one last question and then we'll wrap up. The question is from Nameka Oru, a friend of mine that is with the United Nations Globe legislators, and it's actually to Ambassador Elias. I'm not sure if you're still there, Elias, but if you are, there's a question for you. And the question is, considering Zambia's focus on sustainable agriculture, is there any move by Zambia to reflect this in the new NDCs and align it with long-term low emissions development strategy? I'm just checking if the ambassador is still on the line. Well, Nameka, I think I'll have to send the ambassador an email with your question, and it will be answered for sure via email. Well, it looks like we went past time. We might have to host a second forum and discuss a little bit deeper regenerative agriculture next time. But so far, we've learned quite a bit from all of the experts, and I would like to very much thank the panelists today for joining us, for spending the time and sharing the knowledge. A very special thank you to those who connected from Africa and also from Australia, of course. We've learned that regenerative agriculture can potentially increase soil health, improve carbon sequestration, it improve water conservation, and of course help with biodiversity. So it's a win-win for farmers, for the...
Chris, I had lost you a little bit there, and I couldn't get the whole question.
Oh, that's great that you're back. There was just a question from an African friend of mine from Globe legislators, and he was asking whether, given the focus now on sustainable agriculture for Zambia, is the country considering perhaps reflecting this in the new NDCs and align it with the long-term low emissions development strategy of Zambia? Ambassador?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, Zambia has already implemented several policies right now, and some of them are still under development. Under the Ministry of Green Economy and the Environment, so we have a specific ministry now that is looking into climate change, climate adaptability, and all the mitigation efforts that we must do as a country in order for us to achieve the sustainable future, not only for us as a country, but for the rest of the world. So yes, there is that plan ongoing.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think I knew that was what you were going to answer anyway. And so I was just saying that it was a very productive conversation, especially for those who didn't know enough about regenerative agriculture and the benefits that it can actually bring for farmers, for the economy, and for nature and biodiversity. So there's a lot still to be done from a regulatory basis, from sharing knowledge, and from being able to implement certain things. But I do believe that technology, and we didn't go deep into technology today, perhaps we can talk about it next time, but I do believe that technologies will take us there as well, because there's a lot being developed, and the pace of technology and innovation is growing. So one area that we should incentivize is obviously new technologies that can actually solve a lot of issues for us. So I would like to thank again to everyone who attended today, especially the panelists. Thank you, Senator Davey. I know it's a busy week, and as it always is in Parliament. And thank you very much, Dr. Elias, for joining us. I will be seeing you next week in Canberra, and hopefully we'll continue our collaboration, our program. And I want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation again for supporting this exchange in agriculture, which is so important for every country important globally. So thank you very much for joining us. There will be a recording of this session for those who missed part of it or who couldn't attend. So we'll be sharing that very soon with you. Thank you and have an excellent night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Bye.